Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about a single photograph that brought down a Soviet intelligence operation and destroyed an American family. On the morning of October 23, 1977, at approximately 10:15 a.m., FBI Special Agent Daniel Matthews sat in an unmarked Ford sedan parked on Massachusetts Avenue in northwest Washington, D.C., with a Nikon F2 camera equipped with a 300mm telephoto lens resting on his lap. The weather that day was overcast with a light drizzle that had started around 9 and showed no signs of stopping. Matthews, 34 years old, had been assigned to the Washington Field Office's Soviet Counterintelligence Squad for 3 years. His assignment that morning was unremarkable, one of dozens of similar surveillance operations conducted every week as part of the FBI's systematic monitoring of known and suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the United States Capitol. The target of the surveillance was Alexei Dmitrovich Kovrov, a 41-year-old attaché at the Soviet embassy who held the official title of Second Secretary in the Cultural Affairs section. According to FBI records, Kovrov had arrived in Washington in August 1975 with his wife, Natasha, and their 2 children. His diplomatic file listed his responsibilities as coordinating educational exchanges and cultural programs between the Soviet Union and the United States. The FBI's assessment, based on signals intelligence and previous surveillance operations, was that Kovrov's actual position was as a case officer with the KGB's First Chief Directorate, responsible for recruiting and handling American intelligence assets. Matthews had been following Kovrov since 8:30 that morning, when the Soviet diplomat had left his apartment building in the Glover Park neighborhood. The surveillance technique Matthews employed was called loose tail, maintaining visual contact with the subject while staying far enough back to avoid detection. Kovrov had driven his government-issued black Chevrolet Impala to a Shell gas station on Wisconsin Avenue, where he'd filled the tank and purchased a newspaper. He'd then driven to a delicatessen on Connecticut Avenue, emerging 12 minutes later with a paper bag. From there, Kovrov had driven to Rock Creek Park, entering from Beach Drive and parking his vehicle in a small lot near Pierce Mill. At 10:12 a.m., Kovrov had exited his vehicle and begun walking along one of the park's trails. Matthews documented this with several photographs, standard procedure for any counterintelligence surveillance operation. At 10:15 a.m., as Kovrov walked along the trail that ran parallel to Rock Creek itself, he stopped at a wooden bench approximately 75 yards from where Matthews was positioned. Matthews raised his camera and began photographing using continuous shooting mode. Through his viewfinder, Matthews watched as Kovrov sat on the bench, placed the paper bag beside him, and withdrew what appeared to be a newspaper, not the one purchased earlier that morning, but a different publication. Kovrov appeared to read the newspaper for approximately 3 minutes. Then, at 10:18 a.m., a man approached from the opposite direction. Matthews would later describe this man as appearing to be in his early to mid-40s, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. He wore a navy blue windbreaker, khaki pants, and white sneakers. As he approached the bench where Kovrov sat, he appeared to stumble slightly, as if he'd caught his foot on an uneven section of the trail. Kovrov looked up from his newspaper. Through the camera's viewfinder, Matthews could see the 2 men exchange what appeared to be a brief conversation, no more than 15 or 20 seconds. The man in the windbreaker gestured toward his shoe as if explaining his stumble. Kovrov nodded and appeared to say something in response. Then the man continued walking, passing the bench and continuing south along the trail. After the man had passed, Kovrov returned his attention to the newspaper for approximately another minute. Then he folded the newspaper, placed it on the bench beside him, picked up his paper bag, and began walking back toward his vehicle. He did not take the newspaper with him. Matthews documented all of this, shooting a total of 47 photographs during the 20-minute period. In his report, he noted that the interaction between Kovrov and the unknown man had been brief and could easily be dismissed as an innocent encounter between strangers. However, two details troubled him. First, Kovrov had left the newspaper on the bench, a newspaper he had been reading moments before. Second, approximately 3 minutes after Kovrov had departed, the man in the blue windbreaker reversed direction and walked back past the bench. As he did so, he picked up the newspaper Kovrov had left behind. This type of exchange, what intelligence professionals call a brush pass or dead drop, was a common technique for transferring information between a case officer and an asset. The newspaper could have contained anything: a message written in invisible ink, a microdot with photographed documents, instructions for future meetings, or simply a signal. To any casual observer, the encounter would have appeared entirely innocent, but Matthews had been trained to notice exactly these kinds of interactions, and he had documented the entire sequence on film. The photographs were developed later that same day at the FBI's Washington field office. The contact sheets showed the full sequence: Kovrov approaching the bench, sitting down, reading the newspaper; the unknown man approaching, their brief interaction, Kovrov leaving, and the unknown man returning to collect the newspaper. What the FBI did not have was the identity of the man in the blue windbreaker. The photograph that would eventually expose him was frame number 31 in Matthews's sequence. It had been taken at the exact moment when the unknown man had looked up toward Kovrov while gesturing toward his shoe. The angle of the shot, the positioning of the sun despite the overcast conditions, and the telephoto lens's compression of the background had combined to produce an image with exceptional clarity of the man's face. Within hours of the photographs being developed, copies were circulated within the FBI's counterintelligence division. The standard procedure was to compare surveillance photographs of unknown subjects against existing files, both FBI records and records from other intelligence agencies. The process in 1977 was entirely manual, requiring agents to examine filing cabinets full of photographs looking for matches. For the first 3 days, the search produced nothing. The man in the blue windbreaker did not match any known or suspected Soviet intelligence assets in the FBI's Washington field office files. On October 26, 1977, 3 days after the photograph was taken, copies were sent to FBI field offices in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The photographs were also shared with the Central Intelligence Agency. On October 31, 1977, 8 days after Matthews had taken the photographs, FBI agent Rebecca Harrison was reviewing the images at the Bureau's New York field office when something triggered her memory. Harrison, 38 years old, had been working counterintelligence cases for 11 years. She had what colleagues described as an exceptional visual memory, particularly for faces. She retrieved a file from a storage cabinet, not a counterintelligence file, but a background investigation file dating back to 1971. The file contained documents related to a security clearance review for a Department of Defense contractor. Among the documents was a photograph taken 6 years earlier showing a man in his early 30s wearing a suit and tie, seated against a neutral background. Harrison believed it was the same person. The man's name was Robert William Chambers. In 1971, when the background investigation photograph had been taken, he had been 31 years old, married with 2 young children, and working as an electronics engineer for a defense contractor called Synertech Industries based in suburban Maryland. The company specialized in radar systems and communications equipment for military applications. Chambers's security clearance had been granted in 1972, giving him access to classified information designated as secret. By 1977, according to employment records, Chambers had been promoted to senior systems engineer with access to an expanded range of classified projects involving early warning radar systems designed to detect incoming aircraft and missiles. Harrison's identification of Robert Chambers initiated what would become one of the most intensive FBI investigations of the late 1970s. The operation, given the code name Red Book, would eventually involve more than 40 agents working in shifts to maintain surveillance of Chambers, his movements, his contacts, and his professional activities. Robert William Chambers had been born in 1940 in Baltimore, Maryland. His father, Thomas Chambers, had worked as a machinist in the city's shipyards during World War II and afterward at a steel mill. His mother, Ruth, had been a secretary. According to FBI interviews with former neighbors and teachers, Robert had been an academically gifted child with a particular aptitude for mathematics and science. He had graduated from Baltimore Polytechnic Institute in 1958, then attended the University of Maryland on a partial scholarship studying electrical engineering. In 1963, during his senior year, at the university, Robert had met Ellen Walsh, a nursing student. They had married in June 1964, immediately after both had graduated. Their first child, a daughter named Sarah, had been born in 1966. Their second child, a son named Christopher, had been born in 1969. The Chambers family lived in a 3-bedroom ranch house in Rockville, Maryland, in a subdivision called Potomac Woods. The house, purchased in 1971, sat on a 1/4-acre lot with a small backyard where the children played. Ellen worked part-time as a nurse at a pediatrician's office. Robert commuted approximately 20 miles each way to Synertech Industries facility in Laurel, Maryland. According to later interviews with neighbors, the family appeared entirely conventional, washing their car, working in the yard, loading the children into their station wagon for weekend outings. The surveillance of Chambers began on November 3, 1977, 6 days after Harrison had identified him from the photograph. FBI agents, working in rotating teams, documented his departure for work each morning, typically between 7:15 and 7:30 a.m. They followed his route to the Synertech facility, noting any stops or unusual detours. They documented his lunch breaks, his departure from work in the evening, and his route home. For the first 3 weeks, Chambers's routine appeared entirely mundane. He drove to work, spent approximately 8 to 9 hours at the facility, purchased lunch from restaurants near the Synertech building, and drove home. On weekends, he took his children to a local park, went grocery shopping with his wife, and attended a birthday party at a neighbor's house. There were no meetings with Kovrov or any other known Soviet intelligence officers. There were no visits to Rock Creek Park or any other location that might serve as a dead drop site. Then, on November 28, 1977, at approximately 2:15 p.m., Robert Chambers left the Synertech facility during what appeared to be a routine lunch break. Instead of driving to one of his usual restaurants, he drove north on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway and took the exit for Greenbelt Park, a 1 to 100-acre protected forest area managed by the National Park Service. FBI agents following Chambers documented his vehicle entering the park and pulling into a parking area near one of the trailheads. Chambers exited his vehicle and began walking along a trail. 2 FBI agents on foot surveillance followed at a distance. Approximately 15 minutes into his walk, Chambers stopped at a section of the trail where a fallen tree lay partially across the path. According to the surveillance report, he spent approximately 30 seconds examining the area around the fallen tree, then reached beneath the log and retrieved something. The agents could not see clearly what he had taken, but photographs showed Chambers placing a small object, possibly an envelope or a small package, inside his jacket. Chambers then returned to his vehicle, drove to a McDonald's restaurant near the Synertech facility, purchased lunch, and returned to work at 3:07 p.m. The FBI now had documentation of what appeared to be a dead drop retrieval. The decision was made to intensify the surveillance, with particular attention to any unusual activities Chambers might engage in at home. The FBI obtained authorization for a wiretap on the Chambers residence's telephone line. For 3 days following the Greenbelt Park incident, the surveillance produced nothing unusual. Chambers's telephone conversations consisted of routine domestic matters. Then, on December 1st, 1977, at approximately 9:47 p.m., after the Chambers children had been put to bed, FBI agents monitoring the wiretap recorded a conversation that would become central to the subsequent prosecution. Ellen Chambers answered the telephone and was greeted by a male voice that did not identify himself. The conversation was brief. Male voice: "Hello, may I speak with Robert?" Ellen Chambers: "Just a moment." Sound of phone being set down, footsteps, muffled conversation. Robert Chambers: "Hello?" Male voice: "The package you received needs to be delivered by the 15th. The location will be the same as last time." Robert Chambers: "I understand. 15, same location." Male voice: "Correct." Call ends. The conversation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Voice analysis suggested with moderate confidence that the male voice belonged to Alexei Kovrov, though the poor audio quality and brevity of the call made definitive identification impossible. The FBI contacted Synertech Industries and, under conditions of strict secrecy, informed company security officials that an employee was under investigation for suspected espionage. The company agreed to monitor what classified materials Chambers accessed. Between December 1st and December 14th, Chambers's work computer access logs showed that he had retrieved technical specifications for 3 separate radar systems that Synertech was developing under Department of Defense contracts. 2 of these systems were classified secret, and 1 was classified confidential. According to later expert testimony, this information would have allowed Soviet military planners to develop countermeasures and potentially neutralize the effectiveness of these systems. On December 14, 1977, Robert Chambers called Synertech's main office and reported that he was ill and would not be coming to work. FBI agents maintained surveillance of the Chambers residence throughout the day. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Ellen Chambers left the house with both children, driving to a local shopping mall. Robert remained at home alone. At approximately 3:15 p.m., agents observed Robert in the backyard, burning papers in a small outdoor fireplace. The burning continued for approximately 20 minutes. The following day, December 15, 1977, was the date specified in the telephone call for the delivery. Surveillance began before dawn. Chambers left his house at 8:10 a.m., earlier than his usual departure time for work. He was carrying his briefcase, a brown leather case he typically took to the office. He drove not toward the Synertech facility, but northwest, toward Washington, D.C. Chambers drove into the city and parked on a residential street in the Cleveland Park neighborhood. He exited his vehicle and began walking. He appeared to be paying attention to his surroundings in a way that suggested counter-surveillance awareness, pausing occasionally as if to look in shop windows, but actually, agents believed, checking for any sign he was being followed. He entered a pharmacy and spent approximately 8 minutes inside, though agents watching through the store's windows reported that he did not appear to purchase anything. He then continued walking, eventually entering the National Zoo. Inside the zoo, Chambers walked along the main path for approximately 15 minutes. FBI agents, dressed as ordinary visitors, followed at distances of 50 to 100 yards. Chambers turned onto a smaller path that led to a relatively secluded area near the zoo's administration buildings. He sat on a bench near a cluster of bamboo plants, placing his briefcase beside him. According to surveillance reports, he sat there for approximately 12 minutes. At 9:38 a.m., a man approached from the opposite direction. FBI agents would later identify this man from surveillance photographs as Konstantin Sergeyevich Ivanov, a 36-year-old third secretary at the Soviet embassy who, like Kovrov, was believed to be a KGB intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. Ivanov walked past the bench where Chambers sat, apparently without acknowledging him. However, as he passed, he placed a folded newspaper on the bench beside Chambers's briefcase. Chambers remained seated for approximately another 3 minutes. Then he stood, picked up the newspaper Ivanov had left, placed it inside his briefcase, picked up his briefcase, and walked back toward the zoo's exit. Chambers walked back to his car, drove a circuitous route that appeared designed to detect any surveillance, and eventually drove to a public library in Silver Spring, Maryland. He parked and went inside. FBI agents observed him in the library's reading room, where he appeared to be examining documents from his briefcase. At 11:15 a.m., Chambers left the library and drove to Sligo Creek Park, another forested area with multiple walking trails. He parked and began walking along a trail. FBI agents continued to follow, some on foot and others positioned at various points along possible routes. At approximately 11:47 a.m., Chambers stopped at a point where the trail crossed a small footbridge over Sligo Creek. The bridge was constructed of wood and metal with railings on both sides. According to FBI surveillance logs, Chambers stopped on the bridge and appeared to look down at the water for approximately 1 minute. Then he reached into his briefcase, withdrew what appeared to be a package or envelope, and taped it to the underside of the bridge's railing where it would not be visible to casual passers-by. FBI agents photographed the entire sequence, capturing clear images of Chambers taping the package to the bridge. Chambers then continued walking, completed a loop that brought him back to his vehicle, and drove home, arriving at approximately 1:20 p.m. At the Sligo Creek footbridge, other FBI agents remained in position, maintaining surveillance on the dead-drop location. At 3:32 p.m., more than 3.5 hours after Chambers had left the package, Konstantin Ivanov arrived at Sligo Creek Park. He parked and began walking along the same trail. At 3:48 p.m., Ivanov reached the footbridge, stopped, looked around as if checking that no one was watching, reached under the railing, and retrieved the package Chambers had left. The FBI now had documentation of the entire operation. Chambers retrieving information from Greenbelt Park, preparing the information at home, receiving a signal at the zoo, placing the information at a dead drop, and Ivanov retrieving that information. The decision was made to make arrests. Konstantin Ivanov's diplomatic status meant he could not be arrested or prosecuted under U.S. law, but he could be declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. The State Department was notified of the FBI's evidence, and arrangements were made to formally expel Ivanov, along with Alexei Kovrov and 2 other Soviet diplomats believed to be connected to the operation. Robert Chambers was arrested at his home on the morning of December 16, 1977. According to FBI reports, 6 agents arrived at the Rockville residence at approximately 6:45 a.m. before Chambers would have left for work. Ellen Chambers answered the door, and agents presented her with an arrest warrant. Robert Chambers was in the kitchen eating breakfast. According to the lead agent's report, Chambers, appeared shocked when informed he was under arrest for espionage. His first words were, "I want to speak to an attorney." Ellen Chambers's reaction was one of complete bewilderment. She asked repeatedly what her husband was being accused of and insisted there must be some mistake. The children, Sarah, then 11 years old, and Christopher, then 8 years old, were awakened by the commotion and came downstairs to find FBI agents in their house and their father being placed in handcuffs. According to later interviews, both children would describe this moment as traumatic. Robert Chambers was transported to the FBI's Washington field office, where he was formally advised of his rights. He exercised his right to remain silent and declined to answer questions without legal representation present. A search of the Chambers residence, conducted under warrant, produced significant evidence. Agents found in Chambers's home office a camera designed for photographing documents, several rolls of microfilm, a code book written in cipher, $7,300 in cash hidden in a locked box in the garage, and handwritten notes that appeared to be translations from Russian. Robert Chambers was charged in federal district court with conspiracy to commit espionage and with unauthorized communication of national defense information to a foreign government. The charges carried potential sentences of up to life imprisonment. The case was assigned to Judge Harold Preston of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland. Facing overwhelming evidence, including the surveillance photographs, the wiretapped phone conversation, the dead drop at Sligo Creek, and the materials found in his home, Chambers eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a recommended sentence of 25 years rather than life imprisonment. According to Chambers's debriefing sessions with the FBI, conducted between January and March of 1978, he had first been approached by Soviet intelligence in 1973, approximately 1 year after he received his security clearance. The approach had been made at a technical conference in Chicago, where Chambers had been presenting a paper on radar signal processing. A man who introduced himself as Martin Pierce had struck up a conversation with Chambers at the conference and had expressed interest in Chambers's work. They had exchanged business cards and had remained in occasional contact over the following months. The relationship had developed gradually. Pierce, whose real identity was never definitively established, though FBI investigators believed he was likely a Soviet intelligence officer working under deep cover, had suggested meeting for lunch during subsequent business trips. He had expressed sympathies for progressive political causes and had engaged Chambers in conversations about U.S. foreign policy, military spending, and the nuclear arms race. The recruitment itself had occurred in late 1973 or early 1974. According to Chambers's testimony, Pierce had suggested that information about certain U.S. weapons systems might help Soviet leaders better understand American capabilities and intentions, which could reduce the risk of miscalculation and accidental war. The argument had been framed not as treason, but as contribution to global stability and peace. Chambers claimed in his debriefings that he had initially provided only what he considered to be relatively unimportant technical information. However, FBI analysis indicated that the information had been far more sensitive than Chambers either acknowledged or perhaps genuinely understood. Over approximately 4 years, from 1973 to 1977, Chambers had provided Soviet intelligence with information on at least 9 separate weapons systems and technologies. The FBI's damage assessment, completed in mid-1978, concluded that Chambers's espionage had compromised multiple defense programs and had provided the Soviet Union with significant advantages in understanding and potentially countering U.S. military technology. The financial compensation Chambers had received was surprisingly modest, approximately $27,000 over 4 years. Chambers appeared to have been motivated at least as much by intellectual engagement, political conviction, and the psychological satisfaction of being valued by his handlers as by money. When asked during his FBI debriefings why he had done it, Chambers offered varying explanations that suggested even he did not fully understand his own motivations. At times, he emphasized his opposition to what he saw as aggressive U.S. foreign policy. At other times, he acknowledged that he had enjoyed feeling important and appreciated. At still other times, he expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse, particularly regarding the impact on his family. Ellen Chambers was never charged with any crime. FBI investigators concluded that she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities. In interviews conducted shortly after Robert's arrest, she described their marriage as generally happy, though she acknowledged that Robert had sometimes seemed distracted or preoccupied in the months before his arrest. She had never suspected espionage and had assumed any unusual behavior was related to work stress. The impact on Ellen and the Chambers children was immediate and devastating. Within days of Robert's arrest, reporters had identified the family and begun calling their home and approaching neighbors. Ellen eventually disconnected the telephone. Sarah and Christopher faced difficulties at school. Other children, informed by their parents about the arrest, began to avoid them, or, in some cases, to bully them. According to later accounts from teachers, both children became withdrawn and performed poorly academically in the months following their father's arrest. Ellen made the decision to remain in the Rockville house rather than relocating, though neighbors later reported that she rarely left the property except for necessary errands. She stopped working at the pediatrician's office. The family's financial situation became precarious. Robert's income had been their primary source of support, and while Ellen had some savings, legal costs quickly depleted those resources. Robert Chambers's trial began in September 1978. Because of his cooperation and his agreement to plead guilty, the trial consisted primarily of sentencing proceedings. The government presented evidence of the surveillance operation, the dead drops, the classified information that had been compromised, and the damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense. Chambers's attorney argued for leniency based on his client's cooperation, his lack of any previous criminal record, his expressed remorse, and what the attorney characterized as his naive belief that he was contributing to peace rather than harming his country. The attorney also emphasized the impact that a lengthy sentence would have on Chambers's wife and young children. Judge Preston, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the complexity of the case but emphasized the seriousness of espionage and the damage that Chambers's actions had caused to national security. He noted that Chambers had betrayed a position of trust, had provided sensitive information to a hostile foreign power over a period of years, and had done so for personal gain, even if that gain was not primarily financial. On October 12, 1978, Robert Chambers was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. This was 5 years more than the 25-year sentence that prosecutors had recommended, reflecting Judge Preston's view that the severity of the offense warranted additional punishment despite Chambers's cooperation. Under federal sentencing guidelines in effect at the time, Chambers would be eligible for parole after serving approximately 10 years, assuming good behavior. Chambers was initially incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Ellen visited her husband in prison occasionally during the first 2 years of his incarceration, bringing Sarah and Christopher with her on some visits. However, these visits became increasingly difficult for everyone involved. The children struggled to understand why their father was in prison and what he had done. Ellen found it increasingly difficult to explain a situation she herself did not fully understand. The visits became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether sometime in 1980 or 1981. In 1982, Ellen filed for divorce. Court records indicate that the divorce was uncontested and was finalized in March 1983. Ellen cited irreconcilable differences, though the actual reason was her husband's espionage conviction and imprisonment. The long-term consequences for the Chambers children were profound. Sarah, who had been 11 when her father was arrested, struggled with depression and anxiety throughout her teenage years. According to school records, obtained years later by researchers studying the impact of parental incarceration, her academic performance, which had been above average before her father's arrest, declined significantly. She graduated from high school but did not attend college immediately, instead working at various retail jobs. Christopher, who had been only 8 when his father was arrested, had even less understanding of what his father had done. His mother's attempts to explain were hampered by her own limited understanding and by her desire to protect her young son from harsh realities. According to later interviews Christopher gave to researchers, he spent much of his childhood believing that his father had made a mistake at work and had been punished unfairly. Only as a teenager did he begin to understand the true nature of his father's crimes, and this understanding brought a sense of shame and anger that affected his relationship with his father and with his own sense of identity. The Chambers case led to a comprehensive review of security procedures at Synertech Industries and at other defense contractors working on classified projects. The Department of Defense implemented enhanced background check procedures, more frequent security reviews for employees with clearances, and stricter protocols for monitoring access to classified information. For Alexei Kovrov and Konstantin Ivanov, the Soviet diplomats implicated in the operation, the consequences were primarily diplomatic rather than criminal. Both men were declared persona non grata by the U.S. State Department and were expelled from the United States in December 1977, shortly after Chambers's arrest. They returned to the Soviet Union, where their subsequent careers are not well documented. It is presumed they continued to work for Soviet intelligence in other capacities or locations. The photograph that Daniel Matthews had taken on October 23, 1977, became something of a legend within the FBI's counterintelligence community. It was used in training programs as an example of the importance of routine surveillance operations and the value of photographic documentation. The image of Robert Chambers gesturing toward his shoe while making eye contact with Alexei Kovrov was reproduced in classified training materials and shown to new agents as an illustration of what a dead-drop operation could look like when captured on film. For Matthews himself, the case represented the highlight of his career in counterintelligence. He received commendations from the FBI and was eventually promoted to supervisory special agent. In interviews he gave years later, after retiring from the Bureau, he reflected on the randomness of the success, how, if the weather had been different, if the light had been at a different angle, if he had been positioned even slightly differently, the photograph might not have captured Chambers's face clearly enough for identification. Rebecca Harrison, the agent who had identified Chambers from the photograph 8 days after it was taken, also received recognition for her role in the case. Her exceptional visual memory and her thoroughness in checking background investigation files had been crucial to the investigation's success. She continued working counterintelligence cases until her retirement from the FBI in 1989. Robert Chambers served 23 years of his 30-year sentence. He was released on parole in 2001 at the age of 61. By that time, the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and the world he had spied for no longer existed. He moved to a small apartment in Virginia and took a job doing technical writing for a private company, work that did not require a security clearance and that paid modestly. His relationship with his children remained strained. Sarah, who had married and had children of her own, maintained minimal contact with her father. Christopher had more contact, visiting occasionally, but their relationship was complicated by decades of absence, and by Christopher's ongoing struggle to reconcile his childhood memories of a loving father with his adult understanding of his father's crimes. Ellen Chambers, who had reverted to her maiden name of Ellen Walsh after the divorce, never remarried. She lived quietly, working as a nurse until her retirement in the early 2000s. She declined all requests for interviews about her former husband's case and refused to discuss the matter with anyone outside her immediate family. By all accounts, she built a stable life for herself and her children despite the trauma, but the experience left deep scars that never fully healed. In 2009, Robert Chambers was interviewed by a researcher studying Cold War espionage cases. He was 69 years old, living alone, in declining health. When asked about his motivations for committing espionage, he gave answers similar to those he had provided 30 years earlier during his FBI debriefings, a mixture of political convictions, intellectual engagement, and a desire to feel important. But he also acknowledged, in ways he perhaps had not been able to articulate when he was younger, the extent of the damage he had caused. He spoke about the impact on his children with evident pain. He described receiving a letter from Sarah when she was in her 20s, in which she had written that she could not forgive him for destroying their family and for making her childhood a source of shame. He spoke about Christopher's long struggle with substance abuse problems, which Christopher had attributed in part to the trauma of his father's arrest and imprisonment. Chambers acknowledged that while he had served his legal sentence, the real punishment was seeing what his choices had done to the people he loved. When asked whether he believed his espionage had accomplished anything positive, whether he still believed it had contributed to peace or stability as he had once rationalized, he was quiet for a long moment before answering that he did not know. He said that he had thought at the time that he was helping to prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation, but that in retrospect he could not point to any specific outcome that justified what he had done or the harm it had caused. Robert Chambers died in 2014 at the age of 74. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his espionage conviction, listing only his birth date, his death date, and his survivors. Sarah and Christopher both attended the funeral, along with Ellen, who by that time was 73 years old and in poor health herself. According to people who were present, the funeral was brief and sparsely attended. There were no eulogies that attempted to make sense of Chambers's life or to reconcile his years as a father and husband with his years as a spy and prisoner. The technical information that Robert Chambers provided to Soviet intelligence between 1973 and 1977 became largely obsolete within a decade as radar and weapons technologies advanced. The damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense in 1978 had concluded that Chambers's espionage had compromised U.S. national security. By the 1990s, however, the specific systems Chambers had provided information about had been replaced by newer technologies, and the strategic landscape had been transformed by the end of the Cold War. Whether Chambers's espionage actually affected any specific military or strategic outcomes is impossible to determine. Intelligence operations by their nature involve the accumulation of many small pieces of information that are assembled into larger pictures by analysts and planners. It is possible that information from Chambers influenced Soviet military planning or weapons development. It is also possible that the information was received, filed, analyzed, and ultimately had little practical impact. What is certain is the human cost, not just to Chambers himself, but to his family. Ellen Chambers spent more than 30 years dealing with the aftermath of her husband's choices, including the financial hardship, the social stigma, and the challenge of raising two children who struggled to understand why their father had done what he did. Sarah and Christopher Chambers grew up in the shadow of their father's crimes, dealing with shame, confusion, and the loss of a parent not to death, but to imprisonment and disgrace. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals who were operating within systems and circumstances that shaped their choices. Robert Chambers chose to commit espionage, and he bore responsibility for that choice and its consequences. But he made that choice within a Cold War context that encouraged ideological polarization, that treated classified information as currency in a global competition, and that created opportunities and incentives for espionage. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited and handled him were operating within a system that valued intelligence collection and that treated human assets as tools to be exploited. The FBI agents who investigated him were operating within a system that prioritized national security and that granted broad authorities for surveillance and investigation. All of these individuals were, to varying degrees, acting according to the logic of the systems they inhabited, and all of them contributed to outcomes that harmed people who had little or no agency in the situation. Ellen Chambers, Sarah Chambers, Christopher Chambers, and many others whose lives were disrupted by the case. The photograph that Daniel Matthews took on October 23, 1977, captured a moment that would unravel a Soviet intelligence operation and send a man to prison for 23 years. But photographs can only capture surfaces, the visible world of faces and gestures and physical locations. They cannot capture motivations, rationalizations, regrets, or the ripples of consequence that spread outward from a single moment in time. Robert Chambers was 37 years old when that photograph was taken in Rock Creek Park. He was 38 when he was arrested, 61 when he was released from prison, and 74 when he died. The photograph captured him at the midpoint of his adult life, at the moment when his choices were about to catch up with him, when his carefully maintained double existence was about to collapse, when the ordinary suburban life he had built was about to be destroyed. In the photograph, he looks like an ordinary middle-aged man, slightly out of shape, with graying hair and an unremarkable face. There is nothing in the image that suggests what he was doing or what would happen to him. That is perhaps what makes it most unsettling. The banality of it, the ordinariness, the fact that espionage and betrayal can look, in frozen moments captured on film, exactly like everyday life. The larger question raised by the Chambers case is what to do about the gap between legal responsibility and moral complexity. The legal system treated Chambers's case as relatively straightforward. He had violated clear laws against espionage. He had compromised classified information. He had done so knowingly and repeatedly, and therefore he deserved significant punishment. From a legal perspective, this was correct and appropriate. But from a human perspective, the case was more complicated. Chambers was neither a monster nor a hero. He was an ordinary person who made choices that he rationalized at the time, who enjoyed feeling valued and important, who compartmentalized the implications of what he was doing, and who failed to anticipate or understand the full consequences of his actions. When those consequences became undeniable, when he was arrested, when his family was destroyed, when his children were traumatized, he experienced what appeared to be genuine remorse. But that remorse, however genuine, could not undo the harm. The challenge in reflecting on cases like this is to acknowledge both things simultaneously, that individuals bear responsibility for their choices, and that those choices are made within contexts that shape and constrain what options seem available, what rationalizations seem plausible, and what consequences seem real or abstract. To focus exclusively on individual responsibility is to miss the systemic factors that enable and encourage espionage. To focus exclusively on systemic factors is to absolve individuals of agency and accountability. Robert Chambers made choices. He chose to engage with a Soviet intelligence recruiter. He chose to provide classified information. He chose to accept payment. He chose to continue the relationship for 4 years. He chose to lie to his wife, to his colleagues, to himself about what he was doing and why. Those choices were his, and he bore responsibility for them. But he made those choices in a world divided by Cold War tensions, in a society that classified enormous amounts of information and then relied on imperfect systems to protect that information, in a defense industry that granted security clearances to thousands of people while providing limited oversight, in an intelligence environment where Soviet and American agencies competed to recruit assets and collect information. Those systemic factors did not cause his choices, but they created the conditions in which those choices became possible and, from his perspective at the time, attractive. The Chambers children, Sarah and Christopher, bear no responsibility for any of this. They were children who loved their father, who had no knowledge of his activities, who were traumatized by his arrest and its aftermath, and who spent decades dealing with consequences they did not deserve. The photograph remains. It is evidence, history, training material, a frozen moment of ordinary-looking espionage, but it is also a reminder that every intelligence operation, every surveillance photograph, every arrest and prosecution involves human beings making choices and bearing consequences, and that those human dimensions extend far beyond what any image can capture. Robert Chambers was 37 when the photograph was taken. He was 74 when he died, believing that he had destroyed his family for something that, in the end, had not mattered as much as he had convinced himself it did. And in between, he lost everything: his freedom, his marriage, his relationship with his children, his sense of himself as a good person, his hope that his life had meaning beyond the harm he had caused.